Hello, dear friends. Welcome to the English Globe, your home for learning English through world events and intelligent conversation. I'm Adam, and with me is Julia. Today we explore a story that sits at the very center of European politics, a story about power, strategy, and the future of democracy in France. Our topic is Macron's gamble. Can France escape political deadlock before collapse? This is not just a question about one man or one country. It is a question about how modern democracies survive when politics becomes too divided to function.
That's right, Adam. Today's episode is a deep look into the challenges President Emmanuel Macron faces as he tries to lead a nation caught between different political forces. France is one of the world's oldest democracies and a founding member of the European Union, so what happens there has a major impact on the rest of Europe and even beyond. When we talk about a political deadlock, we mean a situation where leaders cannot make decisions because the parliament is divided and no single group has enough power to pass laws. It's like a car stuck in traffic. The engine is running, but nothing moves forward.
This topic is important because political deadlocks can affect more than just the government. They influence the economy, education, healthcare, jobs, and the daily life of every citizen. When a country's leaders are unable to agree on how to move forward, everything slows down, reforms stop, confidence falls, and people start to lose trust in the system. France has reached such a moment, and President Macron's decisions in the coming months could decide whether the country recovers its stability or faces an even deeper crisis.
We chose this topic for the English Globe not only because it's current and global, but also because it's an excellent opportunity for English learners to expand their vocabulary and comprehension. During this episode, we'll discuss political terms such as coalition, reform, polarization, opposition, and governance. Understanding these words is essential for anyone who wants to follow international news in English. So, dear listeners, this podcast is not just about politics. It's also a classroom for improving your English while discovering how the world works.
Before we begin, we'd love to invite you, our dear listeners, to support the English Globe. If you're enjoying this podcast and want to keep learning English with us, please take a moment to click the like button and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us reach more learners around the world and keeps this educational project growing. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Are you in Europe, Asia, Africa, or the Middle East? What are your thoughts about today's topic? Do you think France can overcome this political crisis, or is it heading toward something more serious? Your opinions help us make every episode better.
Thank you, Adam. And to all our new listeners, welcome. We are so happy that you're here. This channel is designed for people who want to improve their English by listening to real discussions about global events. We speak clearly and explain key ideas so that even if you're a beginner or intermediate learner, you can still understand and enjoy. Every week we bring new topics, politics, history, culture, and world affairs, all in simple but professional English. So stay with us till the end, because by listening carefully, you'll not only learn about France, but also become more confident in understanding complex English conversations.
Now let's look at why France's current situation matters so much. France is the second largest economy in the European Union and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. What happens in Paris often influences decisions in Brussels, Berlin, and even Washington. Over the last few years, France has experienced a sharp political divide between the far left, the far right, and the shrinking center. This has made it extremely difficult for President Macron to pass laws, introduce reforms, or keep social peace. The parliament, which is supposed to help the president, has become a battlefield of competing ideas and constant argument.
Many people in France are frustrated. They feel that their voices are not being heard. Some protest in the streets, others turn to new political movements that promise change. Macron, who once represented youth and energy, now finds himself facing challenges from both sides, from the National Rally on the right and the New Popular Front on the left. His government tries to balance modernization with social protection, but every step seems to bring new opposition. This is why we call it a gamble. It's a risk, a political bet that he can still control events even when the numbers in Parliament say otherwise.
For English learners, this situation is also a good example of how language reflects politics. Words like deadlock or collapse are not only vocabulary items, they describe real struggles that affect nations. When we say a government is in deadlock, it means it can't move forward. When we talk about collapse, it means institutions lose their power or people's trust. Learning these terms through context makes them easier to remember and understand. That's why we mix real-world content with language practice here on the English Globe.
So, dear listeners, as we begin this journey through France's current political crisis, remember that our goal is both to inform and to educate. We want you to improve your English listening skills, learn new words, and also think critically about how democracy works. Politics may sound complex, but with clear explanations, you'll see that every event, every decision, is built on basic ideas of agreement, compromise, and leadership. And that's something we can all learn from no matter where we live.
In the next part, we will dive deeper into the background of Emmanuel Macron's political career, how he rose to power, what his vision for France was, and how his leadership style has shaped both his successes and the challenges he now faces. So stay tuned, listen carefully, and remember to keep practicing your English by repeating and noting down new words as we go along. This is the English Globe, helping you learn English through the world's most important stories. Emmanuel Macron stands today as one of the most complex and debated political figures in modern Europe, a leader whose rise from an unknown technocrat to the presidency of France seemed almost cinematic, driven by ambition, vision, and a promise to bridge the deep divide between left and right that had long paralyzed French politics.
When Macron launched his political movement La République En Marche, in 2016, he presented it as a revolutionary centrist force that rejected old ideologies, embraced modernization, and aimed to unite citizens under a new spirit of optimism that combined social justice with economic reform, innovation, and global cooperation.
In the early days of his presidency, Macron's charisma and confidence gave many French citizens hope that their country could adapt to the challenges of globalization, technology, and demographic change. Yet these same qualities also made others view him as distant, intellectual, and disconnected from the daily struggles of working families.
To understand Macron's current political strategy, we must look at his belief in what he calls pragmatic reformism, a philosophy that seeks to achieve results not through ideology, but through efficiency, compromise, and long-term economic stability, even if that means taking unpopular decisions in the short term.
This strategic vision has guided many of Macron's policies, such as changes to France's labor laws, pension reforms, and efforts to reduce bureaucracy. However, each of these measures has come with significant political cost, sparking protests, parliamentary resistance, and growing dissatisfaction among citizens who feel left behind.
The most serious political test came during the Yellow Vest movement in 2018, when ordinary people wearing yellow safety vests began demonstrating against high fuel taxes, economic inequality, and what they saw as a government favoring the wealthy. These protests shook the country and forced Macron to reconsider his approach to governance.
Although he managed to survive that crisis through dialogue, concessions, and strong leadership, the experience left deep marks on both his presidency and his public image, reminding him that even bold reformers must maintain social balance and public trust if they wish to preserve national unity.
In his second term, Macron faces an even greater challenge because his centrist party lost its parliamentary majority. leaving him in a position where every law requires negotiation with rival groups who often share little ideological ground and may even prefer political stalemate to compromise.
This situation creates what experts call a hung parliament, a state of political equilibrium in which no single party controls enough seats to pass legislation independently, forcing leaders to build coalitions or risk paralysis. It is a delicate dance that requires patience, persuasion, and timing.
Macron's political opponents, both on the left and the right, understand this weakness and use it strategically to block his reforms, hoping to exhaust his government's energy, erode public confidence, and position themselves as the true voice of the French people ahead of the next election cycle.
Despite these obstacles, Macron continues to believe in his role as a stabilizing figure for France and for Europe, portraying himself as a bridge between tradition and progress, national interest and European unity, and as a leader willing to take calculated risks to preserve the democratic center.
His speeches often reflect this belief in strategic patience. He frequently describes his mission as not merely managing day-to-day politics, but preparing the French state for the realities of the 21st century: digital transformation, climate responsibility, and global competition.
However, critics argue that Macron's technocratic style, which emphasizes expertise, efficiency, and top-down management, alienates many citizens who long for emotional connection and empathy from their leaders, particularly during periods of inflation, social unrest, or moral uncertainty.
It is in this tension between reform and representation that Macron's gamble truly lies. He seeks to modernize France's institutions while maintaining democratic legitimacy. But the more decisive he becomes, the more he risks appearing authoritarian, and the more cautious he becomes, the more he risks losing momentum.
In this fragile balance, his personal leadership style becomes both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability, for while it allows him to act swiftly in crises, it also concentrates blame directly upon him when policies fail or when people feel ignored by the political elite in Paris.
From an educational point of view, this situation also provides English learners with a fascinating example of words such as leadership, strategy, reform, and deadlock in action, showing how vocabulary reflects real events and how one individual's decisions can shape an entire nation's direction.
In the next part, we will look deeper into how France's parliament works, what causes a political deadlock, and why the current system has become so resistant to change. By understanding these mechanisms, we can see why Macron's gamble may either transform France's democracy or push it toward dangerous stagnation. To truly understand France's current political struggle, we must first explore how its parliamentary system functions and why the nation finds itself trapped in what many analysts call a structural deadlock, where decision-making slows to a crawl and government authority becomes fragile despite the president's constitutional powers.
The French political system was designed under the Fifth Republic, created in 1958 by Charles de Gaulle, to balance strong presidential leadership with parliamentary accountability. It allows the president to direct national policy while still relying on the National Assembly for legislative approval, a mechanism that usually ensures stability but can also breed gridlock.
In theory, the president holds significant executive authority, yet every major reform still requires parliamentary support, and without a clear majority, the president must negotiate with opposition parties whose agendas often conflict sharply with his own, leading to compromises that weaken reforms or delay their implementation indefinitely.
This kind of legislative paralysis is what we call political deadlock, a term describing situations where different institutions or political groups hold enough power to block each other's actions, creating a standstill where no major decisions can be made, even though everyone agrees that something must be done.
The roots of the current deadlock lie in the results of the 2022 legislative elections, when Macron's centrist alliance lost its absolute majority in the National Assembly, forcing the government to rely on smaller parties or independent lawmakers whose loyalty is uncertain, and whose interests rarely align perfectly with the president's.
This situation forces Macron's team into constant negotiation, forming temporary alliances for each vote and making concessions on policy areas such as labour reform, immigration, or environmental regulation, which not only slows progress, but also creates an image of indecision and inconsistency in the eyes of the public.
The National Assembly, which is the lower house of Parliament, is the arena where these conflicts unfold most visibly. Debates often stretch for hours, amendments are introduced endlessly, and opposition leaders use procedural tactics to delay or derail government initiatives, turning routine sessions into intense political battles.
Meanwhile, the Senate, though less powerful, also plays a critical role in shaping legislation and public perception, especially when it disagrees with the government's proposals, because such disagreements signal division and dysfunction within the political elite, reinforcing the narrative of national paralysis that frustrates ordinary citizens.
To manage this complex environment, the French Constitution provides the president with certain extraordinary tools, the most famous being Article 49.3, which allows the government to pass a law without a parliamentary vote unless the opposition successfully brings down the cabinet through a motion of no confidence.
While this article gives the president a way to bypass gridlock, its use is politically dangerous because it can be perceived as undemocratic, provoking public anger and uniting opposition parties against the government, as seen during the controversial pension reform debates that ignited widespread protests across France.
This combination of limited majority, fragmented opposition, and public fatigue creates a fragile equilibrium where every political move feels risky. One wrong step could trigger a vote of no confidence, a cabinet resignation, or even the dissolution of parliament, each of which would deepen uncertainty in an already divided society.
In democratic systems, negotiation and compromise are natural, but in France's current situation, the ideological gap between the left, right, and centre is so wide that meaningful compromise often becomes impossible, turning cooperation into confrontation and leaving vital reforms suspended in endless discussion.
For example, the right-wing National Rally demands stricter immigration control and protection of French identity, while the left-wing New Popular Front insists on stronger social welfare and workers' rights. Macron's centrist party sits awkwardly in the middle, trying to satisfy both, yet pleasing neither.
This polarization reflects deeper divisions in French society itself, between urban and rural populations, between those who feel they benefit from globalization and those who feel excluded by it, and between citizens who want more Europe and those who prefer national independence from Brussels' influence.
Because of these divisions, each parliamentary session becomes not merely a policy debate, but a symbolic struggle over France's identity, future, and moral direction, which transforms even technical issues such as budget allocation or education reform into ideological battlegrounds that consume enormous political energy.
For English learners, it's useful to note that the term coalition government refers to a situation where multiple parties share power because no single group controls a majority. Such arrangements require constant negotiation and trust, both of which are in short supply in France's current polarized climate.
As this deadlock drags on, citizens begin to lose confidence not only in the government, but also in the democratic process itself, perceiving politics as a game of endless argument with no tangible results, which can feed extremism, abstention, and social disillusionment, further weakening the country's unity.
Political scientists often warn that prolonged legislative paralysis can paralyze an entire nation's capacity for reform. As the executive grows hesitant to act, the opposition becomes emboldened to resist, and public frustration transforms into protest, distrust, or even calls for radical political alternatives.
The irony is that the Fifth Republic was designed precisely to prevent such instability. It was meant to protect France from the fragmented coalition politics of the Fourth Republic. Yet decades later, the system once seen as a safeguard now finds itself trapped by the same forces it was built to contain.
In educational terms, this scenario gives us valuable vocabulary such as stalemate, fragmentation, polarization, and compromise, all of which describe not only France's predicament, but also challenges faced by many democracies worldwide that struggle to reconcile diversity of opinion with the need for decisive governance.
In our next section, we'll explore the major political forces shaping this deadlock, the left, the right, and the center, to understand their goals, their conflicts, and how each one views Macron's leadership at this critical moment for the future of France's democracy. To understand France's current political gridlock, it is essential to analyze the key political forces that dominate the National Assembly, each representing distinct ideologies and constituencies, with the right-wing National Rally advocating strict immigration controls and national identity policies, the left-wing New Popular Front demanding stronger social protections and wealth redistribution, and the centrist coalition led by Macron attempting to navigate a precarious middle path between reform and stability.
The right-wing National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, has grown stronger in recent years, gaining popularity among voters who feel excluded from economic modernization, rural populations concerned about job losses and cultural change, and citizens frustrated with perceived government inefficiency, making it a formidable opponent to Macron's centrist agenda and a constant source of tension in parliamentary negotiations.
On the opposite side of the spectrum, the left-wing New Popular Front, composed of socialists, environmentalists, and labor-oriented groups, pushes for expansive public services, higher taxes on the wealthy, stronger labor protections, and ambitious climate policies, often opposing reforms proposed by Macron, which they see as favoring business elites at the expense of ordinary citizens, thus creating a persistent obstacle to legislative consensus.
Macron's centrist coalition, officially La République En Marche, attempts to balance these extremes by promoting economic modernization, European integration, and pragmatic reforms aimed at stimulating growth while avoiding excessive social disruption. However, with the loss of a parliamentary majority, the party struggles to maintain influence and must negotiate constantly with independents or minor parties to pass even routine legislation.
This delicate balance creates a political environment where every policy initiative becomes a negotiation between competing interests, with Macron forced to weigh the demands of his coalition, the objections of the opposition, and public opinion, while attempting to implement reforms that are essential for economic stability, social cohesion, and France's international reputation.
The ideological differences between these political forces are not merely abstract. They reflect deep divisions within French society itself, including generational gaps, urban-rural contrasts, and conflicting views on globalization, immigration, and France's role in Europe, which makes compromise extraordinarily difficult and heightens the risk of political paralysis.
In parliamentary practice, this means that votes are often unpredictable, alliances are temporary, and every legislative proposal is subject to extensive scrutiny, amendment, and sometimes outright rejection, forcing Macron's government to rely on strategic calculations, personal influence, and careful timing to achieve any progress, even on issues that are widely acknowledged as necessary for national welfare.
The constant tension between these political forces also creates opportunities for populist movements, which can exploit public frustration with perceived governmental inaction, promising simple solutions to complex problems, thereby complicating the president's task of maintaining a stable and functional government while pursuing long-term reforms designed to strengthen France's institutions.
For English learners, this section highlights vocabulary such as coalition, opposition, negotiation, reform, and polarization, showing how political terms are not only words in a textbook, but real concepts that affect society, economics, and public life, providing an ideal opportunity to understand complex sentences and professional discourse while following global current events.
As we move forward in this discussion, it is crucial to recognize that the clash between left, right, and centre is central to Macron's gamble. Any failure to unite even a minimal majority could stall crucial reforms, provoke social unrest, or diminish public confidence in government, which demonstrates how political strategy, public opinion, and legislative arithmetic are inextricably linked in modern democratic governance.
In the next section, we will examine how economic and social pressures intensify this political deadlock, exploring how inflation, unemployment, strikes, and public dissatisfaction create additional hurdles for Macron, demonstrating that political strategy cannot succeed in isolation and must respond to real-world conditions affecting the daily lives of citizens. Even as France struggles with political deadlock, the country faces mounting economic pressures that intensify the risk of instability, with inflation steadily rising due to global supply chain disruptions, energy costs climbing to unprecedented levels, and everyday citizens feeling the pinch as food, housing, and transportation expenses increase, creating a climate of uncertainty that complicates the government's ability to implement effective policies and maintain public trust.
Energy costs, in particular, have become a flashpoint for social tension, as households and businesses confront rising electricity and gas prices, leading to increased demand for government subsidies and intervention. This situation fuels discontent among the population, making it more difficult for Macron to pursue reforms that require financial restraint or cuts, and amplifying public perception that the political system is out of touch with ordinary citizens' struggles.
Unemployment, especially among young people and those in marginalized regions, adds another layer of complexity to France's social landscape, as millions of citizens struggle to find stable work, which contributes to frustration, anxiety, and a sense of disillusionment, encouraging protests, strikes, and a general perception that the state is failing to provide opportunities or security for its most vulnerable populations.
Strikes have historically been a hallmark of French civic engagement, and today they play a critical role in amplifying social pressure on the government, as unions and workers organize demonstrations to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and protection against rising living costs. These actions, while legitimate, often paralyze transport, disrupt businesses, and add to public frustration, creating additional political risk for leaders attempting to maintain order.
Protests, marches, and public demonstrations reflect more than just isolated grievances. They are a visible expression of social dissatisfaction that signals deep-rooted concerns about inequality, governance, and fairness, challenging the government to respond effectively while balancing competing interests, which requires political skill, empathy, and strategic communication to prevent further escalation into widespread unrest.
The combination of economic stresses, inflation, rising energy costs, and persistent unemployment, with ongoing social activism, creates a feedback loop, where financial hardship drives discontent, discontent drives political mobilization, and political instability makes it more difficult for policymakers to address economic problems, thereby reinforcing the cycle of tension and uncertainty across the nation.
In addition to financial and employment pressures, public perception and media coverage amplify the sense of urgency and crisis, as news outlets report on strikes, protests, and economic challenges in real time, which shapes public opinion, heightens expectations for immediate government action, and increases scrutiny of Macron's leadership, creating a complex environment in which political decisions are influenced as much by perception as by policy.
Social inequality also contributes to the pressures Macron faces, as citizens living in urban centres with access to education and technology often have very different priorities than those in rural or economically disadvantaged regions, creating tension over resource allocation, public services, and taxation, which makes policy compromise extremely challenging in a parliament already divided along ideological lines.
These economic and social pressures have a tangible effect on the president's political strategy, as every reform proposal must now be carefully weighed against its potential impact on inflation, employment, energy affordability, and public satisfaction. Even minor missteps in policy can provoke strikes, spark protests, or generate negative media coverage, limiting the government's room for maneuver.
From a learning perspective, this section demonstrates the use of descriptive and explanatory language, showing cause and effect relationships such as rising energy costs causing public protests, unemployment leading to social unrest, and inflation intensifying political challenges. For English learners, these sentences provide both vocabulary and grammatical models for discussing complex societal issues in professional and clear English.
In the next section, we will explore possible paths Macron might take to navigate this multifaceted crisis, analyzing strategies such as reforms, coalition building, or constitutional tools, and examining how these approaches interact with both political deadlock and economic pressures, demonstrating the delicate balance between leadership, public expectation, and institutional constraint in contemporary France. Faced with political deadlock and rising social pressures, President Macron must carefully consider his possible strategies, balancing the need for decisive action with the risks of further public frustration. If he chooses to push reforms without broad support, he might achieve short-term policy goals, yet risk provoking protests, parliamentary opposition, or even motions of no confidence that could destabilize his government entirely.
One possible path involves reforming key policies in a step-by-step manner, negotiating with smaller parties, independent lawmakers, and moderate factions to create temporary coalitions that allow legislation to pass. If Macron were to successfully build such alliances, then he might restore partial functionality to Parliament, maintain public trust, and gradually advance his broader agenda without triggering a political crisis.
Another strategy Macron could employ is the dissolution of the National Assembly, which would allow him to call early elections in hopes of securing a more favorable parliamentary majority. However, this is a high-risk maneuver because if voters reject his party at the polls, then he could face even weaker representation, increased opposition strength, and heightened social unrest, potentially worsening the deadlock he seeks to resolve.
The French Constitution also provides powerful tools that Macron might utilize, such as Article 49.3, which allows the government to pass legislation without a parliamentary vote unless a motion of no confidence succeeds. If he were to invoke this article, then necessary reforms could proceed more quickly. Yet this action might be interpreted as authoritarian by citizens and opposition parties, creating additional political and reputational risks.
Policy concessions represent a less dramatic but strategically important path, where Macron could offer compromises to opposition parties on contentious issues such as labor reform, taxation, or public spending. If such concessions were accepted, then Parliament could approve legislation, social tensions might decrease, and Macron's ability to govern effectively would be preserved, though some critics might argue that he is weakening his mandate.
Centre alliances in particular could be crucial in navigating this deadlock, as Macron's moderate coalition might find common ground with smaller centrist or pragmatic parties. If Macron were to strengthen these partnerships, then he could gradually rebuild support for his agenda, demonstrating both political skill and adaptability, and potentially creating a more stable governing environment despite the ideological divisions around him.
Each of these strategies involves careful consideration of timing, public perception, and parliamentary arithmetic. If Macron miscalculates, then a well-intentioned reform or election could backfire, emboldening opponents, intensifying protests, and increasing the likelihood that economic and social pressures exacerbate the political crisis.
For English learners, this section illustrates modal verbs such as might, could, would, and hypothetical structures like if X were to happen, then Y might result, showing how speculation and conditional thinking are expressed in professional political discourse, while simultaneously enhancing comprehension of global events and governance processes.
The challenge, therefore, is to evaluate each potential path not only in terms of immediate political gains, but also in terms of long-term sustainability, public trust, and institutional stability. If Macron carefully calibrates his choices, then he may gradually steer France out of its deadlock. But if he misjudges public sentiment or opposition resistance, then the crisis could deepen, threatening the country's cohesion.
In summary, Macron's options, whether pursuing reforms, dissolving the assembly, invoking constitutional powers, forming alliances, or offering concessions, all involve strategic calculation, awareness of public reaction, and careful timing. If these actions are executed skillfully, then the president could preserve his authority and implement meaningful change, illustrating the delicate balance between leadership, democracy, and social expectation in a modern European state.
In the next section, we will explore the risks and dangers of each potential path, considering how collapse, instability, and public backlash might occur if Macron's gamble does not succeed, and how these scenarios could affect not only France, but also its position within the European Union and the global economy. Despite possible strategies, Macron faces significant risks that could jeopardize not only his political agenda, but also the stability of the French state itself. If his government were to collapse due to parliamentary opposition, failed reforms, or public discontent, then France might be left with a caretaker regime, unable to pass meaningful legislation, while social tensions could escalate and create uncertainty both domestically and internationally.
One major concern is that public protests, which already reflect widespread dissatisfaction with economic hardship and political gridlock, could intensify and potentially turn violent. If demonstrations escalate beyond peaceful expression, then police intervention, strikes, and street unrest could crowd out institutional processes, paralyzing essential government functions and creating a perception of national chaos.
The collapse or weakening of government institutions could also erode confidence among global investors and international partners. If financial markets perceive France as politically unstable, then foreign investment might decline, interest rates could rise, and the French economy could experience significant slowdowns, compounding domestic social pressures and increasing the urgency of effective governance.
European Union implications must also be considered, as France plays a central role in EU policymaking, financial stability, and collective decision-making. If the French government were unable to fulfill its commitments or manage domestic instability effectively, then EU-wide projects, agreements, and fiscal plans might be jeopardized, highlighting how national crises can ripple across the continent.
Even short-term instability carries high stakes, because if Macron's administration were forced to operate in a caretaker capacity, then reforms would be delayed, public dissatisfaction could deepen, and the perception that leadership is indecisive might embolden opposition parties, potentially altering the balance of power in subsequent elections and weakening democratic norms.
Conditional risks also extend to social cohesion, because persistent economic pressure, rising inequality, and perceived government inaction could lead citizens to lose faith in institutions. If confidence declines sharply, then civil society may fracture. Trust in law enforcement and political bodies could erode, and informal or populist movements might gain influence, further complicating governance.
This scenario illustrates why contingency planning is critical, as governments must anticipate not only routine opposition, but also extraordinary events, such as escalated strikes, violent protests, or sudden political defections. If such contingencies are not managed properly, then the consequences could cascade across multiple sectors, from public services to international relations, leaving leaders vulnerable.
For English learners, this section demonstrates cautionary and risk-focused vocabulary, including terms like jeopardy, contingency, collapse, instability, and backlash, as well as the use of conditional clauses such as if X were to happen, then Y might result, which are essential for expressing hypothetical and potential outcomes in professional, analytical English discourse.
Ultimately, the combination of political deadlock, social dissatisfaction, economic pressures, and institutional vulnerability creates a precarious environment in which every decision carries consequences. If Macron misjudges timing, public sentiment, or parliamentary dynamics, then the risks of collapse, instability, and international repercussions could rise sharply, turning a political gamble into a national crisis.
In the next section, we will examine international reactions and global context, exploring how allies, investors, and neighbouring nations perceive France's political situation, and how global pressures can either stabilise or exacerbate domestic challenges, offering English learners new vocabulary for discussing geopolitics and economic interdependence in clear, descriptive language.
To understand France's political deadlock, it is useful to examine how other democracies have faced similar challenges and managed to break stalemates, because looking at historical examples such as Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Israel can provide insight into strategies, compromises, and risks, while demonstrating how political systems, public pressure, and institutional design influence the resolution of prolonged parliamentary impasses.
Italy, for instance, has repeatedly experienced fragmented parliaments that required coalition governments to maintain stability. In 2018, after months of negotiation, a coalition was formed between two ideologically opposed parties, demonstrating that compromise, while sometimes uncomfortable, can allow governance to continue. Yet the Italian case also shows that temporary agreements may be fragile and subject to collapse if consensus weakens.
Belgium provides another instructive example, where government formation can take years due to complex federal and linguistic divisions. In 2010, Belgium went 541 days without an official government, relying on a caretaker administration to manage essential affairs, showing that countries can survive extended deadlock, yet prolonged uncertainty carries risks for economic confidence, international relations, and public patience.
Spain experienced a similar situation following the 2015 general elections, when no party secured a majority. Negotiations and repeat elections were necessary, ultimately resulting in a coalition government that balanced power between conservative and centrist parties, illustrating how electoral processes and compromise strategies can restore functional governance even in highly polarized systems.
Israel, known for frequent coalition crises, has often resolved deadlock by forming large multi-party alliances or by holding early elections. In 2021, after repeated stalemates, a rotation agreement between rival parties allowed for a functioning government, showing that creative solutions, flexibility, and negotiation can overcome deadlock. Yet such arrangements may also be fragile and temporary.
Comparing these cases with France highlights both similarities and differences. Like Italy and Israel, France faces ideological fragmentation, while like Belgium, it must manage strong institutional procedures that complicate quick decision-making, and like Spain, it may consider coalition or negotiation strategies to achieve legislative progress without destabilizing public confidence.
Lessons from these comparative cases suggest that breaking deadlock often requires a combination of pragmatism, patience, and compromise, along with a willingness to accept temporary arrangements that balance power, address immediate policy needs, and maintain public trust, emphasizing the importance of flexibility in navigating complex parliamentary landscapes.
From a teaching perspective, this section introduces comparative and contrastive language, linking devices such as however yet, while similarly and in contrast, as well as narrative past tense to describe historical events, which helps English learners understand professional ways to analyze and explain political developments across different countries.
In conclusion, examining Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Israel, illustrates that while political deadlock poses serious challenges, democracies can survive and adapt through coalition building, creative negotiations, caretaker administrations, or repeated elections, offering both cautionary and hopeful lessons for France as Macron navigates his own precarious situation.
In the next section, we will explore the public's role and civil society influence, considering how citizens, media, and interest groups can affect political outcomes, shape reform possibilities, and influence the success or failure of strategies designed to break deadlock, providing English learners with vocabulary related to civic engagement, public opinion, and social influence.
Citizens play a critical role in shaping political outcomes, and even in the midst of a deadlock, there are concrete actions they can take to ensure their voices are heard. Listeners should understand that expressing demands through petitions, letters to representatives, or participation in peaceful demonstrations can influence lawmakers, highlight urgent social issues, and create momentum for reform.
You ought to stay informed about local and national policies because knowledge empowers action. By following reputable news sources, attending town halls, and engaging in community meetings, citizens can provide constructive feedback, ask critical questions, and hold elected officials accountable for decisions that affect economic stability, social welfare, and governance effectiveness.
Joining civil society organizations or advocacy groups is another important avenue, because these organizations aggregate citizen voices, lobby for specific reforms, and monitor government performance. Listeners should consider volunteering, contributing, or collaborating with these groups to strengthen public influence and ensure that policy discussions reflect diverse perspectives.
Media engagement is equally vital, as citizens can write opinion pieces, participate in social media campaigns, or contact journalists to highlight neglected issues. By doing so responsibly and ethically, they can shape public discourse, educate others about political challenges, and encourage representatives to respond to legitimate concerns without resorting to conflict or disruption.
Participation in local politics provides an additional layer of influence, because municipal councils, school boards, and community committees often manage issues that directly affect daily life, such as infrastructure, education, or environmental initiatives. Listeners should vote, attend meetings, and communicate with local officials because small, consistent actions collectively strengthen democracy and civic engagement.
It is also important to remember that civic engagement should always be constructive, lawful, and focused on dialogue rather than confrontation. Citizens ought to practice patience, persistence, and respectful debate, because these qualities enhance credibility, foster cooperation, and increase the likelihood that political leaders will take their concerns seriously and consider them in policy-making processes.
By understanding the tools available, petitions, advocacy groups, social media, local councils, and direct communication with representatives, citizens can effectively participate in democratic processes, influence reform agendas, and ensure that their voices contribute meaningfully to resolving political deadlock and shaping a responsive government.
For English learners, this section introduces imperative forms such as should, ought to, and consider, along with civic vocabulary, including petition, advocacy, accountability, engagement, and participation, demonstrating how professional, instructive language can describe both action and responsibility in a real-world political context.
Ultimately, active civic engagement empowers individuals and communities to contribute to governance, hold authorities accountable, and influence policy outcomes, illustrating that even in times of deadlock, citizens are not powerless, and their informed, organized, and persistent participation can meaningfully impact the political and social trajectory of their country.
In the final section, we will provide a summary and concluding reflections, synthesizing the challenges, strategies, risks, and lessons learned, while offering guidance for listeners to apply these insights to both their understanding of France's political situation and their own civic responsibilities, reinforcing vocabulary, comprehension, and analytical thinking in English.
As we explore the long-term implications of France's political deadlock under Macron, it becomes evident that the situation is not just a temporary challenge, but a window into the resilience and vulnerabilities of modern democracy. If the deadlock persists, then institutional stability, citizen trust, and policy effectiveness may all be tested, demonstrating how leadership decisions, legislative procedures, and public participation intersect to shape national outcomes, which is crucial for both citizens and observers of global politics.
One major implication concerns institutional resilience, because the French Constitution provides mechanisms such as Article 49.3, caretaker governments, and parliamentary negotiation tools, which allow the state to function even in periods of crisis. If these mechanisms are well utilized, then political deadlock can be managed without severe disruption. Yet, over-reliance on extraordinary powers could erode democratic norms, creating tension between efficiency and legitimacy that future leaders must carefully navigate.
Economic and social consequences are also profound, as unresolved deadlock can exacerbate inflation, slow investment, and amplify public dissatisfaction. If citizens perceive that government inefficiency worsens their daily lives, then frustration may manifest in protests, strikes, or political apathy, illustrating how governance is inseparable from social and economic conditions, and how the health of democracy relies on public confidence as much as institutional procedures.
For policymakers, this scenario highlights the importance of strategic foresight and adaptability, because decisions made under pressure can have lasting consequences. If leaders fail to anticipate social reactions or misjudge parliamentary dynamics, then temporary measures could trigger longer-term instability. But if decisions are guided by analysis, negotiation, and public engagement, then political resilience and public trust can be strengthened, demonstrating that leadership is both reactive and proactive.
Internationally, France's deadlock may affect its role in the European Union, NATO, and global diplomacy. If instability persists, then France's influence on EU policymaking, collective security, and international economic agreements could be reduced, potentially limiting the country's ability to shape regional decisions, while domestic weakness might invite external scrutiny, showing that national governance is linked directly to geopolitical standing and global perception.
Comparatively, other democracies that have experienced prolonged deadlock often emerge with lessons for institutional design, citizen engagement, and coalition management. If France studies these examples, then it may develop more robust mechanisms for negotiation, crisis management, and public consultation, demonstrating that political challenges provide opportunities for learning, reform, and strengthening the democratic process for future generations.
For English learners, this section introduces vocabulary and expressions related to governance, long-term planning, and political analysis, including terms such as resilience, legitimacy, foresight, geopolitical, institutional, and public trust, while modeling complex sentence structures, conditional clauses, and explanatory discourse that improve comprehension and professional communication skills in English.
From a civic perspective, this analysis emphasizes that democracy is an ongoing project requiring active participation, informed debate, and accountability. If citizens remain engaged, informed, and willing to collaborate with institutions, then political systems are more likely to withstand challenges, adapt to new realities, and implement reforms that address both immediate crises and long-term societal goals, reinforcing the notion that democracy is sustained through shared responsibility.
Social cohesion is another critical consideration, as divided societies struggle to implement reforms and maintain stability. If polarization continues unchecked, then policy decisions may be blocked, compromise becomes harder, and public confidence declines. But if dialogue, compromise, and civic education are emphasized, then social cohesion can be strengthened, allowing governments to operate effectively even under pressure and demonstrating the interplay between politics, society, and governance.
Long-term lessons for leadership also emerge, showing that balancing risk and opportunity is essential. If Macron or future leaders learn from both domestic pressures and international comparisons, then they may develop strategies that combine strategic reforms, coalition building, public engagement, and prudent use of constitutional tools, ensuring that governance adapts to challenges while maintaining democratic legitimacy, which is an enduring skill in modern politics.
Finally, this episode illustrates broader educational lessons for listeners, as understanding complex political dynamics requires attention to cause and effect relationships, conditional thinking, strategic analysis, and civic literacy. If students and learners practice following these examples, then they can improve both English comprehension and critical thinking, while also gaining insight into how leadership, institutions, and citizens interact in shaping the future of a nation.
In conclusion, the long-term implications of France's deadlock demonstrate that political crises, while challenging, are also opportunities for institutional learning, civic engagement, and strategic leadership development. If lessons are absorbed by policymakers, citizens, and observers, then democracy can be strengthened, resilience increased, and future crises managed more effectively, providing both hope and caution for France and democracies worldwide.
This final reflection underscores the interconnectedness of political decision-making, social dynamics, and international influence, showing that no democratic system operates in isolation. If leaders, institutions, and citizens understand their mutual responsibilities, then even periods of intense political challenge can be navigated successfully, offering a model for analyzing, discussing, and learning from real-world governance scenarios in English.
We hope this extended discussion has provided listeners with deeper insight into the complexity of France's situation, introduced advanced vocabulary and professional sentence structures, and encouraged reflection on civic responsibility, critical thinking, and the long-term sustainability of democracy, reinforcing the educational goals of the English globe while keeping English learners engaged and informed.
In sum, France faces a complex and precarious political situation, where parliamentary deadlock, social pressures, economic challenges, and public scrutiny converge to test the strength and resilience of both its institutions and leadership. Macron's options, from strategic reforms and coalition building to constitutional maneuvers, will determine the government's ability to navigate this difficult period. Yet each choice carries potential risks that could either stabilize or destabilize the country further.
Overall, the strengths of the French system, including constitutional safeguards, democratic traditions, and institutional experience, provide avenues for progress, while weaknesses such as ideological fragmentation, public dissatisfaction, and economic pressures magnify vulnerability. If Macron carefully balances compromise, strategy, and timing, then France may avoid collapse and restore functional governance without triggering widespread unrest.
Several scenarios remain possible. The government may succeed in passing key reforms and strengthening alliances, leading to partial stability and gradual economic and social recovery, or it may face intensifying deadlock, escalating protests, and institutional strain that prolong uncertainty, reduce public confidence, and limit policy effectiveness. Predicting outcomes requires careful attention to both internal and external pressures shaping France's political trajectory.
Evaluation of these possibilities suggests that cautious optimism is warranted. While challenges are significant and risks real, history demonstrates that democracies can survive periods of gridlock, reconcile competing interests, and rebuild trust through negotiation, compromise, and citizen engagement, highlighting that political deadlock is serious but not necessarily terminal for a nation with resilient institutions.
In terms of teaching, This final section illustrates how to use summary language such as in sum, overall, ultimately, and evaluation phrases like may, could is warranted, while modeling the use of future tense to discuss predictions, showing English learners how to professionally synthesize complex information and express nuanced judgment about real-world events.
For listeners seeking insight into France's outlook, the key lesson is that leadership, negotiation, public participation, and strategic decision-making all interact to shape outcomes. While collapse remains a theoretical possibility, the interplay of institutional strengths, careful strategy, and civic engagement may allow France to emerge from this challenging period with governance intact and social cohesion preserved.
In conclusion, Macron's gamble reflects the delicate balance between risk and opportunity in modern democracy, illustrating that navigating deadlock requires not only political skill but also responsiveness to citizens, awareness of social pressures, and adaptability in the face of uncertainty, providing a compelling case study for students of politics, civic responsibility, and English language learners alike.
We hope this discussion has helped you understand the complexity of France's political situation, while also introducing vocabulary, sentence structures, and analytical language useful for describing current events and governance. By following these examples, listeners can improve both comprehension and professional English expression, gaining confidence to discuss global political challenges effectively.
Thank you for listening to the English Globe, and remember that staying informed, critically analyzing political events, and participating thoughtfully in civic life are essential practices for every engaged citizen, demonstrating that even in the most challenging times, knowledge and involvement are powerful tools for shaping the future.